Hello again. I'm your host, Moose Jaw Matt. Thank you for joining me here on another episode. Yeah. A couple episodes ago, we talked about the shortest living animals, as in how long they're alive, particularly as adults. This episode is the follow-up, the longest living animals. We're going to count down these animals from the sixth longest living animal to the longest living animal, starting with number 6.
Galapagos giant tortoise.
These tortoises are turtles. They are reptiles, which means they tend to have drier skin, scales, claws, things like that. Amphibians, their close relatives, are similar to them in many ways, and yet they're slimier. They tend to have moist skin, live in or near water. Frogs, toads, tadpoles, they don't have scales or claws. Back to our tortoise friends. How long do you think they can live? Longer than many people. Over 100 years, and they come from a really famous place, the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are famous for a couple of reasons, one of which is their extreme biodiversity. Bio means life, so biological diversity is a very great amount of life, and not just one type, but diversity means multiple different kinds. Lots of kinds of life there, on land and underwater. Another reason those islands are famous is because Charles Darwin studied there, and while I do not agree with the conclusions he came to, nonetheless, he did help put those islands on the map in a very significant way because of its biodiversity. These Galapagos giant tortoises are like tanks. They're huge, not only living a long time, but also growing to be large. One thing about these turtles is that they live slow, peaceful lives, somewhat isolated. They don't have any predators, and the things they eat don't move. That's the way I prefer to eat my food. Nice, delicious tacos that don't run away from me. So they spend their time eating cacti, grasses, and fruit. When the months are cooler, which in the Galapagos Islands doesn't mean cold, just cooler, they sleep in the morning and the afternoon, only stirring a little bit during the midday. There's something about this lifestyle and their genetics that helps them live a long time. And now we go on to animal number 5, the 5th longest living animal.
Bowhead whale.
Those tortoises lived to be over 100 years old, and it's hard to get an exact date for those, but as we go on, we'll see it gets harder and harder to get exact dates for when these animals live and when they die. Bowhead whales live to be over 200 years. One interesting thing that happened that led scientists to realize that bowhead whales can live so long and come up with estimates for over 200 years is because in 2007, a bowhead whale had been found off the coast of Alaska. Lodged in its shoulder, that means stuck there, was a harpoon that was 130 years old. That means that whale was hunted in the 1800s. That's an old whale. They date the arrow fragment from the harpoon to about 1880. And this confirms what the Inuit had been saying for a while, that these whales can live for 2 human lifetimes. Pretty accurate. But there's more. In 2019, researchers estimate that they live not only to be 200 years old, but 268 years old, which would be 3 or 4 human lifetimes, if accurate. They came to this conclusion because they studied the genes of the bowhead whale and somehow came up with this. But we still have 4 more animals to go. So let's move on to number 4.
Greenland shark.
Speaking of Greenland, was that foreshadowing earlier? Were we looking ahead at the next animal? Greenland sharks. These sharks are large and they live in the cold waters off Greenland, hence their name. They're probably the ugliest sharks you'll ever see. If we were to give a survey, most people would say the Greenland sharks are not very attractive. They're huge, kind of stubby-shaped, greenish, stunted fins, blunt snouts, and sometimes they even have worm-like parasites hanging from their eyes. It's not very appealing. But it is estimated that they live to be up to 400 years old. They are scavengers because they live in such cold areas. They just have to eat whatever they can, which means they can probably go a long time without eating. If you've ever seen any videos of them, you recognize how slowly they swim. They are the sloths of the shark world. Researchers have found some of the following items in their stomachs. Polar bears, no surprise. Reindeer, no surprise. And even horses. For as much as we do know about them, which isn't much, there's a lot more we don't know. Animal number 3.
Ocean quahog.
What a name. Ocean quahog? If you're thinking of like an ocean sort of pig, you would be well off the mark. It's a type of clam, and it really doesn't look like much, but apparently they can live up to 400 years old. They too, like the Greenland shark, can live up to 400 years. Estimates, of course. They don't do much. They just sort of sit on the bottom and filter out sediment and get the nutrients they can from the ocean as it passes by. Let's move along to animal number 2.
Glass sponge.
Glass sponge. I'd never even heard of one before. I don't know how they come up with this estimate. 11,000 years? Wow! Is that even possible? One thing about this animal, the sponge, is that it's called a multicellular organism. Even though it looks like a plant, it is not. It's an animal. It's a colony of animals, actually. They live in the deep sea, and that might be part of the key to their success in surviving so long because there's not much happening there. I think if you set up a camera in one part of the deep sea and let it record anything that happened, it might be weeks before it saw anything. There's not much life down there, but there is apparently enough that some organisms can survive. Those who do survive also don't have very many predators, so there's a chance to live a long time. That leads us to the longest living animal known.
Immortal jellyfish.
If you've heard of the word immortal, that means it does not die. Now, this is one of those sort of trick things. It is true, it doesn't die exactly, but it does something absolutely remarkable. If you've never heard of this, fasten your mental seatbelts. We're not going to drive very fast, but it's pretty wild. In the 1980s, scientists discovered that this tiny jellyfish, the immortal jellyfish, which is not really any bigger than a little fingernail on your hand, can change at the end of its life. So it grows up, develops, lives its life, and unlike the mayfly, which only lives for a matter of minutes or hours, this can live longer, but then even still, once it gets to the end of its life, it does something. Instead of dying, which we are used to, it changes. When it gets to the end of its life, or even if it feels threatened or that it's in danger, it will go back in its life cycle to become a polyp. Now, if you think of coral, that's basically what it's becoming. It goes and attaches itself to the seabed, wherever it's at, and becomes a polyp. Imagine a butterfly transforming back into a caterpillar, or back into a chrysalis. That's essentially what's happening here. Once it goes back to being a polyp with stalks branching out like trees, like tree limbs that have little buds, those little polyp buds then grow and break off and become new jellyfish. So it doesn't really die. It just transforms and becomes a polyp and then that polyp becomes more jellyfish. The typical jellyfish you imagine with a bell and then the strings hanging down. Not strings, they're tentacles, of course, but that's known as a medusa. The medusa is the adult. And again, it grows, lives, develops, and if it needs to, when it gets to the end of its life, it'll go back to being a polyp. Backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. The immortal jellyfish. Really remarkable. This creature, the immortal jellyfish, does something so remarkable, it's honestly difficult to believe and fathom. We are used to life and death. Life and death. Someone's born, they grow up, they develop, they live their lives, and then they get to old age, and they eventually die, if there's not an accident sooner in life. But it makes me wonder, are there other things that we could look forward to that are also difficult for people to believe? These are not the words of Moose Jaw Matt. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. And a flash in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, which means they don't perish, they're immortal, and we will be changed. It's time to give a birthday shout out. Actually, we have a couple. Kendall, happy birthday. Not only you, Kendall, but you're also sharing this birthday shout out with May. Thank you both for caring about the podcast, for listening, and being excited about it. I hope you have wonderful, fun birthdays. I'm Moose Jaw Matt. Until next time, keep exploring your world.